Um, so Chris is actually a conservation biologist. He's actually our conservation officer for Marba and has been very active behind the scenes. For many years, he worked for the Queensland government in various capacities, but currently, I believe he works as a environmental consultant. Um, and Chris gave a talk last year to the Insects in Crisis Symposium that was funded by the Environmental Institute of Australia and New Zealand. And unfortunately, I didn't get to hear that talk. It was a very restricted audience. But we're very delighted that he'll give a talk tonight about that presentation he gave to do with entitled Barriers to Conserving Moths and Butterflies in Policy and Practice. So over to you, Chris.
It's Michael. Could somebody just let me know if they can see the talk screen, or are you seeing my notes?
We can see your screen.
That's better.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, thanks for sticking around, those of you who are still here. My name's Chris, and as Michael said, I am a conservation biologist or an ecologist, and I am working as a consultant these days, which sadly has very little to do with moths and butterflies. It would be great if we had more to do with those in my line of work, because it means that the government's not really doing its job in terms of listing threatened species. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but the title of this talk is Barriers to Conserving Moths and Butterflies in Policy and Practice. So it's quite relevant to both my role with Marba and my job. I'd like to just start with an acknowledgement of country, acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're all meeting on today. And this talk was prepared the land of the Yagara, Turrbal and Quandamooka peoples in southeast Queensland. So to start this discussion, I guess it's a story about data deficiency, because I personally believe that's what drives the majority of what I'm going to talk about today. So conservation policy and practice is a system. So it's something that the government puts in place that helps them drive funding and legislation and policy and all of those things that they have under their control to enact conservation efforts. And that system requires inputs, generally from the scientific community, but also from everybody, from the citizen science community, and also from sort of general community members who have an interest in this stuff. And then those two, I guess, interact with each other. And we'll get into the details of that as we go on. But I think that the general community expectation is that that's the government's job and that they're doing it. And to conserve a species, really, you need two things. One thing you need to know is how to conserve the species. If you don't know where it occurs, or if you don't know what is the reason it's threatened, or if you do know why it's threatened, if you don't know how to fix it, then there's not a whole lot you can do. And then once you know those things, then you still need the resources to put that knowledge into action. And even for birds and mammals, these are things we're still struggling with. We're still seeing extinctions of vertebrates in Australia and globally. So, for some of the best funded and best understood groups, it's still an issue. But what about animals that don't have a backbone? So when scientists talk about data deficiency, they've broken it into categories of deficiency. So there's an excellent paper by Cardoso et al. From over a decade ago now, where they talk about, I guess, the modes of data deficiency that they have observed in conservation biology, and it's things like whether people know about the species enough to care about it, whether policymakers and stakeholders have enough knowledge about invertebrate conservation issues to want to fund them or to make policy about them, whether science is adequately funded and there's enough expertise in the area to do good work on it. And then we talk about shortfalls. So things like how many species are undescribed, whether we know their distributions, whether we know anything about their abundance and the trajectory of their populations, and whether we know what they require from their environment to stay as a healthy population. So when I talked about a system before, we talk about conservation being a virtuous cycle, but unfortunately, I think for invertebrate conservation, it's more like a vicious cycle where you have data deficiency in the area, which leads to a lack of conservation policy and planning because you can't conserve what you don't understand. And if you have no policy or planning effort, then there'll be no funding or investment in that from the government. And if there's no funding or investment, unfortunately, there's very little science these days that can happen in the absence of funding, with the exception, I guess, of certain kinds of citizen science. But taxonomy tends to be a highly expert-driven process generally. And so, understandably, groups like Lepidoptera lag behind when there's not enough funding to drive that kind of work. And when there's no scientific effort being put in, then of course things remain data deficient, and that cycle continues. So looking at going back to these dilemmas that we talk about, so how they relate to Lepidoptera. So the public dilemma, looking at different levels of interest. So, and I don't like comparing invertebrates to vertebrates because it's kind of like, we're all on the same team here. We all want the same thing, which is conserving species. And I don't like to say we should pull down birds or mammals because they get the lion's share of the funding. That's not true. That they should get less. It's that the government should provide more, I guess, in this regard. But if you look at if you look at the different levels of interest and support, so BirdLife Australia has around 350,000 supporters listed as a figure on their website. The Australian Entomological Society had 410 members when I wrote this talk, and MARBA had about 200 members. So, many orders of magnitude difference in the national groups that oversee those two taxonomic groups. And similarly with the political side of things, there's a really poor fit between the current policy in threatened species listing and how the various protection acts like the EPBC Act or the Nature Conservation Act, for two examples, actually look at flora and fauna. So, for example, with the threatened species listing criteria, the thresholds that are given for critically endangered for populations is something like 50 breeding pairs. So for a bird, that would be a catastrophically low number, but obviously for a moth or a butterfly, 50 breeding pairs can have many, many caterpillars, and potentially, if they're well protected, you could easily recover a population from that small amount. But that doesn't mean that it's not threatened. It's actually more about whether the host plants are well conserved or if the threatening processes are under control. But I guess the main point there is that there's not a good fit between how the criteria are put together and how they relate to whether a moth or a butterfly is actually threatened or not. And so it's really hard sometimes to shoehorn a species into these criteria, which are really set up for mammals and don't fit other groups all that well. And then with the scientific dilemma, obviously there's, MARBA's grants notwithstanding, obviously not a lot of funding around for this kind of work. Most conservation funding is for threatened species, and there's very few threatened species that are moths or butterflies. So just to give you some statistics on this, for vertebrates, the threatened species lists are made up of between 11 and 15% of those species groups. So it's about 11% of birds are listed as threatened, about 15% of mammals, and the other two groups, reptiles and frogs, are somewhere in the middle there. So that's terrestrial vertebrates. And most of those groups have been 100% assessed. That means, at least at the IUCN level, every single vertebrate, every single terrestrial vertebrate in Australia has had its listing assessed as to what its current risk of extinction is. In contrast, only 0.04% of Australia's invertebrates have been assessed by IUCN, and I would wager considerably fewer have been assessed at the government level. So looking at the shortfalls now, so the Linnaean shortfall is the shortfall in the number of species described. So for the estimate for moths in Australia is that there's around 20,000 species here, but only about 10,000 of those have actually been given names. And this is in part because of a dire lack of taxonomists, which, as I mentioned earlier, is partly because lack of funding, lack of jobs available for those sorts of things. We've recently, MARBA has recently put together a database of taxonomic expertise in moths, and we found that for 26 of our 71 families of moths, there's no expert that we could find to put against that family, which is not a great situation to be in, particularly when you consider the potential issues around invasive species that they would have a biosecurity risk for the country. Not to mention, of course, the obvious conservation issues with not having someone who can identify species when they're discovered. And then also things like relation shortfall. Do we know what the range maps are for most moth species? The answer is not really. Butterflies, thankfully, we do. Michael Braby has done a really excellent job of putting together range maps over the years. And citizen science is now contributing quite a lot into expanding those range maps and I guess making them more accurate. And so, yeah, for butterflies, I guess we have a proof of concept that it's doable, but obviously butterflies, we have under 500 species in the country, whereas we're talking about 10,000 moths with names and another 10,000 without names, which makes putting together even range maps quite challenging. And this can obviously be a huge impediment for doing any kind of place-based conservation for a species if you don't even know where it occurs. So the Prestonian shortfall is again about do we understand trends in populations? Have a think about things like, could we detect a collapse in a moth or butterfly population? Do we understand what the butterflies and moths in Australia do in terms of migration patterns? We know some species are migratory, but we don't really understand a lot of those patterns in any kind of detail. So some examples of this, I guess, the Australian fritillary, which may be our first Lepidopteran extinction, was a species that was last collected in 2005. The last plausible sighting that I've been able to find information on was in 2015. So that means it's now over 10 years since the last plausible sighting of this species. So it may be extinct, it may not, we're not sure. But this is a species that went from relatively well known and being found fairly regularly, and all of a sudden it just wasn't found at all anymore. And another example of this would be the narrow-winged awl, which I'll get to later in the talk. And the bogong moth, of course, is a potential collapse in action. We're not 100% sure of this, but certainly the indication from known colonies in the Snowy Mountains is that numbers are declining extremely rapidly for this species. And then the Hutchinsonian shortfall is what the species sensitivities are to change, and do we really understand what the exposure of our Lepidoptera are to things like climate change, habitat fragmentation, increasing frequency and severity of fire, and things like that. So all of these things factor into how we can conserve them and whether or not any kind of action the government could take would be effective. So to give you some, I guess, some numbers around what some of these things look like. So the relation shortfall, looking at species data availability. So I just threw together some numbers for this talk when I put it together last year, and I didn't update them for this talk, but I did actually look them up. So I'll talk about that in a second. But if you look at the relative availability of data, so for birds, 87 million records in the Atlas of Living Australia, mammals, 5 million, frogs and reptiles, less than 2 million. The whole of Lepidoptera had less than 3 million records at the time I wrote this talk. Now, I updated that today. So there were 10,914 species in the Australian Faunal Directory last year in June. This year, when I looked it up, there are now 10,944. So that means only 30 new species described in the last year. So we're not doing great at closing the gap on that one. There are, however, now over 3 million records in ALA. So, we're still collecting records for the group at an increasing rate, which is great. But if you look at that in terms of a records per species by taxonomic group, there's 108,000 records per bird species. Now, obviously, that's not evenly distributed. We don't have 100,000 records of night parrots, but there's a hell of a lot more records of night parrots than there are of most moth species held in the ALA. And all the way to the bottom there, Lepidoptera, there's only 267 records per species for the group. And that's up to 299 now, a year later. I just wanted to give a quick sort of perspective from the New Zealand side of things, because obviously my background is very firmly in Australia, but I spoke with our council member from New Zealand, Robert Hall, and he gave me a bit of an update on where New Zealand's at with this. And I guess the good news is that the New Zealand Lepidoptera fauna is much better known than the Australian. So they probably haven't described everything, but they've certainly got a better handle on what they have than we do here. They do a 5-year review of their threatened species list for Lepidoptera, which is an excellent thing to have. We certainly don't do that here. And the recent review highlighted a few particularly interesting things or potentially alarming things. One was that they used to believe that the alpine fauna were actually relatively safe, but this recent review indicated that they're actually possibly now no longer safe, and that short turf, native grass and wetland species may also be increasingly threatened. And he gave one example of Notareus chrysopeda as a species that hasn't been seen for 20 years and is previously unlisted. So obviously now it's being considered for listing, but possibly too little too late if it's not refound. But he did also provide one encouraging story, which was a citizen science program around a species that they've affectionately called Fred the Thread, Houdiniya flexillissima. And they have had success in reintroducing this species to new restored wetland sites in combination with its host plants, which is really exciting. But he did also note that they really rarely have enough knowledge of life histories and causes of decline to take effective action, which is the same issue that we have here. So even if you know something is threatened, if you don't know why it's threatened or how to fix it, there's not a lot you can do. So that's, I guess, the end of the systematic part of the talk, but I just wanted to take you through a few case studies to sort of, I guess, highlight how this works in action in Australian conservation. So the first one I wanted to bring up is the Illige's ant blue, Acrodipsis illigi. Now, this is a species which has been listed for a long time in Queensland as vulnerable, and it was brought to the attention of the EPBC Act through the Common Assessment Methodology, and was judged to require a new assessment to get it onto the federal list. And unfortunately, in the process of doing that, it was rejected from listing and will now likely be removed from the Queensland list as a result. And the reason that was given was because it's data deficient and didn't meet any of the criteria. And this is ironically because we now know more about it than we did when it was first listed, which is that it's now been recorded in non-mangrove habitats in Queensland. So in the last few years, we've had a number of records in inland parts of Brisbane, so such as Gumdale or Karawatha. I put a couple of those images up in this slide. And because of this and other historic records around Toowoomba and Wild Horse Mountain on the Sunshine Coast, we now believe its habitat isn't bound to mangroves, and that it may have a wider association with allocasuarinas or casuarinas in other parts of the country. And that means that we now no longer know enough about where it occurs to say that it's threatened. So it's a bit of a perverse outcome of this process where somebody quite rightly thought, well, let's get it listed nationally. It's disappearing from the places we knew it occurred, but now it's no longer going to be protected because of that. Another case study that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention, and many of you will probably already be aware of this due to an excellent paper by Peter Valentine, but the narrow-winged awl is possibly the largest population collapse you've never heard of. This is a species that was breeding in the Brigalow Belt, and it was migrating northwards in the many, many millions. So peak migration counts of this species in the Cairns region by Peter were in the order of 24,000 individuals per hour. And then by the 1990s, that count was down to 3,000 per hour, and now none. And this is likely a consequence of over 1 million hectares of their breeding habitat being cleared in the last sort of 50, 60 years. So this is the Brigalow Belt, which is now one of the most cleared habitat types in the country. And this is a direct consequence of that. And the species is, despite this, still least concern at both the federal and state level. The bull oak jewel is another case study I wanted to bring up. And Michael spoke earlier about this. I'm going to talk about the species in general, but I will mention briefly what Michael spoke about earlier. So this is a species with highly specific habitat requirements. So this is a species that we know the distribution because it's very small. We know the host plant, we know its host ant, we know its host ant's habitat requirements, thanks to an excellent paper Michael worked on a couple of years ago. And we also know that it's only found in a small number of roadside remnants, and those roadside remnants are protected only by an in-principle agreement with the Department of Transport and Main Roads. So they're intensely vulnerable to either fire or accidental land clearing. I guess the good news is that those small number of roadside remnants have been increased by this discovery of a new population in the Lockyer Valley. Unfortunately, it was discovered on a block that was slated to be cleared in its entirety. Fortunately, through the negotiations of a number of people in the process, both at the government side and the community side and the consultancy side, it sounds like the likely outcome of this process will actually be that some of the habitat for the species will be retained on site in perpetuity, which would be an excellent outcome if that's how it ends up. But that's still not quite decided at this stage. I did speak about this earlier, but obviously Australian fritillary is possibly our first extinction, or first known extinction, I should say. Its habitat was coastal swamps between Gympie in Queensland and Newcastle in New South Wales. Its habitat requirements were not well understood, but it's believed to have been requiring disturbance of habitat, possibly by fire. And it's worth noting that the places that it lived are some of the most intensely populated parts of the east coast of Australia. And obviously when people live in an area, they don't like fire. So it's possible the intentional exclusion of fire is what led to the extinction of the species. This is only really supposition. But we'll probably never know the real answer to that question because it's unlikely to be refound at this point. The next group I wanted to talk about is sun moths, Cinnamon group. These are day-flying moths, despite the fact that they look and behave like butterflies. And at the time I wrote this, there were 31 described species, but more are being discovered all the time. And the group that I'm talking about specifically are the ones that rely on native grasslands, which is possibly the most threatened biome in Australia. It's obviously been intensely cleared for agriculture, replaced with invasive pastoral grasses. Because if you don't have to cut trees down, of course, it's the most convenient place to run cattle or sheep. And not all cinnamon species are threatened, but many are in dire trouble. And despite this, only one species, the golden sun moth, has been listed as threatened currently. And unfortunately, it may be the least threatened. That's not to say it's not threatened, But in discussing this with some of the experts, Axel Callie's our president, and Fabian Douglas, who put a lot of work into this group, they were both of the opinion that there are a number of species that are in dire straits, and possibly well on the way to extinction. And Fabian specifically talked about the pale sun moth, Cinnamon selene, which possibly has as many as 5 morphs in Victoria, but 2 to 3 of those may already be extinct, and the remaining ones aren't doing well either. So this is a group that I think desperately needs some conservation attention, and more people out there recording sightings of them, so we do understand why they occur better. And the final group I wanted to raise here is the relationship between Boronias and Heliozellid moths. And obviously there's a number of Marber people who've been involved in this. Obviously Doug Hilton and Don Sands, to name a few. And this is a really fascinating relationship, where it looks to be like a two-way reliance in many species, where it's the only pollinator versus the only host plant. So this is a tiny moth, as you can see in the pictures, which is a day flying species for the most part, or group of species, and they seem to have an obligate pollination relationship in a lot of cases. So I know that people are out there doing a lot of work trying to find the pollinators for Boronias that we don't currently know, to see if that relationship extends to all of the Boronias or just to some. But I guess the idea behind this is that this is a co-extinction risk. So if the Boronia goes extinct, and there are many Boronias that are already listed as threatened, then the moth will also go extinct. And vice versa, of course. And if you want to know more about this relationship and the science that's gone into it, there's actually an excellent YouTube video done by Natura Pacifica. And you can either take a screenshot of this, or I'm sure that when we finish this talk, it will go up on our website, and you can look up this link and have a look at the video, because it's well worthwhile. It's a really beautiful video. The other thing I wanted to add to the existing body of work on shortfalls in conservation is one that I think is somewhat unique to our field, which is a shortfall in practitioner skills and knowledge. The idea that, can policymakers even write policy for invertebrates? To have the ability to write policy, you have to have an understanding of how the system works. And the number of people who are in that space in government who would have a good understanding of invertebrate conservation and ecology is probably very low. How many ecologists in roles like mine know how to look for moths and butterflies? And I'm not just talking about adults, but early life history stages. We do have a number of listed moth species, the pink underwing moth, the antbed moth, and the golden sun moth. It's not very many. But if you were to send most conservation ecologists out to look for those 3 species, they wouldn't necessarily know how to look for the host plants, let alone the early life history stages of those species. And I guess the other thing to consider is, what if we did actually have a good understanding of all of this, and we did have a good policy, and we did have good taxonomy, and we had the same rate of invertebrates listed as we do for mammals. So 15% of the entire Lepidopteran taxonomy were suddenly listed as threatened. That would be 1,600 new species. Do we have the infrastructure to support the conservation and the flow-on effects to industry and development and all of those sorts of things that conservation has to feed into at the policy level? I think we don't. I think if we were to list 1,600 new species of moths and butterflies, the whole system would just completely collapse. So, and I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that, if we want to make systemic change, it's not going to be a quick process, because you can't just solve this by throwing a whole bunch of things on a threatened species list. You need the people in place in government, in research, in the community. You need funding to be available. You need the knowledge written down in a way that people can access it, and you need the infrastructure, both economic and in terms of frameworks and systems in place to actually cope with that. So how then do we protect butterflies and moths? So like I said, I think it requires fundamental change to how the system works. And I think that has to start with fostering skills. And I think this is something that MARBA can actually hopefully help with. I think we need greater number of people in professional fields who have skills in identification, and particularly in taxonomy. I think more Australian institutions need to support invertebrate taxonomy, and obviously we prefer to support Lepidopteran taxonomy, but I think this also applies to other invertebrate groups as well. I think citizen science has a really important role to play, and Michael mentioned earlier about the National Butterfly Monitoring Scheme that we're hoping to get off the ground. And I think hopefully that will play a really important part in the future of how we look at conserving butterflies and eventually, hopefully, also moths. We do need more funding, of course, and private funding's great, and the initiatives like the biodiversity fund and things like that we're doing is useful, but obviously much more funding is needed, and that obviously has to come from government in the long run. We need to create invertebrate-specific policy. Shoehorning invertebrates into terrestrial vertebrate fauna-based policy isn't going to work in the long term. And so there needs to be greater literacy in government around invertebrate-specific issues. And hopefully MARBA, along with groups like the Australian Entomological Society, can continue to help working with government on things like that to try and increase their understanding of what the requirements are. And I wanted to finish on a few positives, what success could look like. So there's been a wonderful initiative planting Atlas moth habitat, and I know that project has had some issues over the years, but one of the best things about it is that people are now seeing Atlas moths in suburban Darwin at the moment, which is great. The Richmond Birdwing project, which I know Don has been intimately involved with over many years, is, I think, starting to show some really great results. Lots of people have been planting vine, and we are starting to see Richmond birdwings in places they hadn't been seen for decades, which is really encouraging. And then finally, I wanted to give a shout out to the Zoos Victoria project on the golden rayed blue, which has done amazing community-driven work in Northwest Victoria, both in the space of monitoring and also in the space of restoration and the planting of host plants, and just getting community members on board with both of those things and excited about it and taking ownership of the species. So I think, really that's a sort of a gold standard example of what community-driven conservation can look like in Australia for a Lepidopteran species. And then finally, I just wanted to point out some useful tools for those members who might be interested in learning more about moths and butterflies. So obviously we have some information on our website, which is marba.org.au. One of our counsellors, Kathy, has worked on an amazing lucid key for caterpillar identification. So that's definitely worth a look if you have any interest in early life history stages of butterflies and moths. And then there's a couple of websites that have some good archives of photographs of moths, with the Australian Lepidoptera site, which is very much community driven these days, and getting lots of submissions of all life history stages from egg to adult, which is really great. And then also the Australian Moths Online catalogue, which has obviously digitised quite a lot of specimens from ANIC, which has been great. So I think all of those are really worthwhile resources to have at your disposal. And with that, I am done with my talk. So thank you for your time. And are there any questions?
Chris, thank you very much. Fantastic. Sorry, questions.
Could I just make a comment that perhaps we add to that list of useful tools the book, which has been edited by Roger Kitching, who we have online at the moment, Australian Moths, and I recommend that as being a very valuable tool for anyone interested in conservation aspects. There's at least one chapter or more on conservation issues, and I think that people need to know about the existence of that book, expensive though it is.
Absolutely. And look, I've seen more expensive books as well, Don. I think it's I know that Roger tried to get the price down as much as he could. I agree. It's an excellent book, and it's something that I guess fills a gap in terms of, we obviously have a few tomes that are of great scientific value in the Lepidopteran space, but they are starting to age, and getting a new entry to that field is quite exciting.
Could I just remind people that Marber members do get a 30% discount on that book from Cabby, which still makes it expensive, but brings it down significantly below the recommended retail price. And while I have the floor, could I also point out that I am giving this copy to Marber to be a student prize, presumably to be awarded in the December meeting for what we will judge to be the most interesting and dynamic presentation from qualified people there. So at least somebody will get a cheapie.
Yes, and thank you very much for that, Roger. I'm sure that the lucky student who wins the prize will be quite grateful.
Well, they'll be heavier, that's for sure.
Are there any more questions for Chris? Maybe I can ask one. Chris, you mentioned the large number of invertebrates or moths and butterflies specifically that would be likely to end up on the list if we had the knowledge base of actually understanding their distribution and potential threats and so forth. So what's your sort of opinion? In some ways, I feel like it would almost be, as you said yourself, a number of species that we couldn't handle, even if in the best possible worlds of funding, it would be impossible to individually look after these species. So how do we sort of balance these numbers of species that are potentially threatened and the notion that, of course, as you would agree, it's habitat destruction, which is a most, vicious driver of extinction. And we all understand, that obviously we need to protect grasslands in order to protect grassland-associated insects such as sun moths or certain shrubs and rainforest habitats for other types of species. So how do we balance that? How much knowledge do we actually need when it comes to individual species? And I'm saying that, with almost with little, question marks on either side. How much do we need, and how much knowledge is needed in terms of, habitat biodiversity in more general terms that allows us to protect them?
Yeah, well, good question, Axel. So I guess we usually approach conservation in Australia and indeed globally in two ways. We do species-based conservation, or we do habitat-based conservation. And species-based conservation is largely first aid. It's an emergency response to where habitat-based conservation has failed. And so it's considered as a last resort by governments and by most scientists involved in conservation biology, certainly the ones who wrote the criteria for IUCN, treat it as that way. So the burden of proof is still put on the people who want to save the species rather than assuming it's in trouble and proving it's not. So I guess for moths and butterflies, I actually don't think individual species-based conservation is really a particularly good way to go, because there's not really ever going to be a moth or a butterfly which exists on its own. You need to conserve a host plant. Often you need to conserve a host ant in a lot of cases. You may need to conserve more than one kind of plant. It might be a mistletoe that's attached to another tree, for example. Or it may just be you can't have a moth or a butterfly that uses its host plant in the isolation of, an individual plant in the middle of the paddock. It has to be surrounded by the right habitat. So I think for most Lepidoptera, you can't just conserve just that one species. You've got to conserve everything around it. So, your typical approach to conserving a frog, for example, is to get it into captivity, breed it up, and let hundreds of them go, and hopefully get the population back up to a point where it's okay again, and maybe hopefully treat chytrid fungus at the same time. But for moths and butterflies, I don't know that captive rearing and mass release is going to be a good solution. So I personally think that this is something that has to be very habitat driven. And one thing I guess I would like to put into consideration for people who want to sort of look at this and sort of more holistically is there is one, I guess, avenue through the EPBC Act that may be open to use for this, which is the threatened ecological community part of the EPBC Act. So threatened ecological communities are currently treated as being about the plants, but it is actually possible to look at it in terms of the fauna as well. So you could, for example, write a listing for Victorian grasslands that host cinnamon moths as an ecological community that requires protecting. And then you would have to come up with, I guess, what that looks like in general terms to actually support a listing, and also then the conservation of that group. But it is possible to approach it from that holistic community perspective, rather than just listing a species and then hoping that some kind of recovery plan might be able to be developed and be meaningful.
Yeah. Thanks for that insight. And I totally agree. And I guess we need, a certain critical mass of invertebrates to be listed so that we have, our tools in our toolbox to actually protect habitat. But I think everyone agrees on that. We've got a couple of questions that we might want to try and get through. Steve Williams put his hand up. Do you have a question, Steve? Steve, can you hear us? Or
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you. I was just having trouble unmuting myself. I'm really glad that you asked that question, Axel, and that spawned that conversation, because my understanding is moths and butterflies have such a strong relationship with vegetation, and they are also the group that are predated by everything else. So they have such an important place in the whole ecosystem. And so this conversation around sort of preserving ecological communities and things like that, I think is really, really important. And, looking at these from a whole of systems kind of thinking perspective is just critical. At the moment in Victoria, we have, things like box ironbark. We have 80 or 90% of the natural estate is now gone. But what most people don't realise is that the remaining remnant of that ecological group are 90% degraded. So there's a huge issue around not only what remains, but what condition it's in. And the public is largely unaware of that. And it has such a big impact on the invertebrates and on Lepidoptera in particular. And so given those kind of connections and relationships, what is lacking is the awareness of the impact or the significance of that. And at the end of the day, there are quite a few people who would look at a single moth species and say, well, if we don't protect it, so what? But when you look at it as a whole, they are critically important to the function of our natural systems. And that's the kind of message that needs to get through into our policymakers and government, and also the community. So that's why I was really, really chuffed to hear you say that you're going to have a social media person associated with MABA, because that's the other component of citizen science, I think, that is really, really important in terms of, engendering that awareness in the broader community about the things that we all love, and so that there's some developing recognition there. I mean, I'm really passionate about this stuff, and I'm a little bit crazy, I understand, but these are really, really important things. I've worked in science for a long time in the natural resource area, and we are so critically underfunded, and a lot of that's because we don't actually put the business case forward that identifies these really important fundamental issues and opportunities. In Victoria, if we stopped burning our forests in the way that we're doing at the moment, we would have a huge impact on the lepidopteral community and its ongoing health. For one of them, I'll get off my soapbox. I guess my question is around, how do we as a group begin to make some inroads on some of those sort of big things like social awareness, improved understanding.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
I
Look,
know I'm
I think there's a lot of good points there. Sorry.
All right, I'll shut up.
Look, I think you've made a lot of really good points there, and I think there's some good and some bad news in all of that. I think governments are onto the whole condition of habitat issue, and there is policy that's being implemented around that in terms of the kind of work that I do around developments and things like that. So I think that that at least is something that is being factored into the conservation framework.
Do they have a really good understanding of the impact of not looking after the invertebrates on those higher animals, though, that they're much more focused on?
I absolutely doubt. I doubt that's the case, that they would have any understanding of that. But at least if they are considering the condition of habitat in the decisions of allowing developments and what kind of offsets have to be put in place, that is at least a step in the right direction. But to go back to I guess your broader question, look, I think there is a role that MARBA can play in that. I think social media, as you say, is a really good starting point. Just bringing up the level of community awareness on some of these issues will be really good. And I think, to a small extent, funding good research like Andy's will help. And, putting that out via social media. And obviously, in some parts of the community, selling a Microptera rigid might be a bit challenging. But, the idea that it's something small and it's rare and it occurs in a really small area, but it's really scientifically important. I think it's a really cool story. And so, I think getting that kind of information out there into the community and also potentially leading to a listing of a threatened species, I think is a really positive step forward. And I think the more of that kind of work we can support, the better. And I think there's also a role for MARBA in advocacy in conservation, and this is something that we've been doing, I guess, quietly in the background. We've had a role in some advocacy for Agyrus subterrestris in Victoria, which has been hopefully heading in the right direction. And Michael's been doing some work on this Hyperchrysops pisciatus subspecies in Queensland, which looks like it's going to have a good outcome. So I think that the more that we're able to sort of leverage that kind of work, better. And we can also take a front foot on some of this stuff and actually bring issues to government, to policymakers, where we see the need to. And we don't have to be obnoxious about it. We can present a scientific opinion and provide it to the right person at the right time without sort of being too loud or crude about it. I think MARBA needs to conserve its scientific integrity in that regard. But I do see a role in providing expertise to government because it is sorely lacking at the moment in the invertebrate space, and particularly Lepidoptera.
Yeah, maybe if I can say something, I mean, I mentioned before, but this is again a point where members can and should contribute. You know, the conservation is one of the key pillars of MABA as a society, and that requires input from multiple directions. And you know, this would be individual species, as we discussed, where we need to understand how they're distributed, what their biological requirements are, or understanding what kind of communities we need to protect in order to, you know, preserve biodiversity and all the things that we just mentioned. And I think MABA has a choice here, or an opportunity to actually give a voice to moths and butterflies in all of that discussion. And this is where we can try to establish these special interest groups that I mentioned earlier, where I would really encourage members to, you know, put up their hand and actively think about as to how they can contribute and what that could look like, so that we have, as MABA, a way of actually voicing our concern, not only our concern, but also our expertise, and bring forward notions that are overall helpful in you know, driving the course and making sure that we don't lose more than we have lost up to this point. Yeah, great
Yeah,
discussion.
and I also note that Brian pointed out that obviously the National Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, when it gets off the ground, will also help in that direction too. It can only be beneficial knowing more about where these things occur.
It's worth pointing out that the Conservation Committee of the ESA, that both Don and myself are part of, have been discussing very similar issues within the last couple of weeks. And so some sort of cross communication was probably a good idea. We particularly talked about the idea of trying to think of flagship species which may or may not be critically endangered themselves, but which draw the public attention to insects, or in our case, butterflies and moths, that represent, say, the brigalow or the limestone grasslands or whatever, and use those as hooks into the only way forward, which is habitat conservation in general. So I think some sort of collaboration between a special interest group here and the very active Conservation Committee of the ESA would be a very good thing to bear in mind.
Yeah, that sounds good, Roger. And I know that the Australian Entomological Society have also done some work along similar lines as well.
Great
May I
point.
just make a comment? I think we've got to strengthen the term interactions in all our submissions for listing to link together the threatened species of moth or butterfly we're dealing with and its threatened habitat, whether it's threatened or not. But it's the interactions which are often threatened, and the threatening processes often apply to the interactions more strongly than they do to affect the abundance and survival of the species we're dealing with. So I'd like to strongly recommend and I've just mentioned that to the AES committee too, that if we can strengthen that term interactions, no one wants to use the word ecology anymore, but if we use the term interactions, people understand what we're talking about. It's often the interactions which are disrupted to create a species in its threatened status.
Yeah, I agree, Don. And I think the more we understand about that, the more we can advocate for it as well.
Okay.
I think there's a question from Andy a little further up in the chat as well.
Yes, I was going to bring that up. We won't have much time to discuss it very extensively, but I think it's an important point that we need to remember. So Andy points out that we obviously need to promote ethical behavior among our community, and I think he's referring to potentially collecting butterflies, I guess. I'm not entirely familiar with the labor inside that is specific mentioned, but there is obviously a concern that some of the remaining sites and some of the flagship species may be over-collected, and this is certainly something that MABA would be concerned by, and we absolutely promote ethical behavior when it comes to collecting. So collecting is a valuable part of what we are doing. So we need specimens for scientific research, be it for morphological studies or genomic studies increasingly, and records that actually record the presence of a species in a certain range. But this needs to happen under conditions that are really in line with scientific integrity and scientific research. Chris, do
Yeah,
you have
so
anything to say?
I do. Marba actually has a code of conduct for collecting, which we've got on our website, which I think is something that's definitely worth sharing with people, particularly, for example, with our permits. When people are accessing the Victorian collecting permits, I think they get a copy of that code of conduct with it. But that's been a well thought out set of guidelines for how to be ethical with that kind of thing. The Leeburn site, by the way, is the Hyperchrysops pisciatus site that Andy's referring to. So obviously it's a critically endangered species. People shouldn't be collecting at all unless they have a permit to do so. Some of those collars on trees, though, Andy, might have been from Michael's study, which was, I think, a non-lethal collection. I think that was just part of his study. Anyway, Michael can talk about that later potentially. But look, I think that one thing that might be useful to point out here is this is another area that has been in the policy and legislation space, well thought through. So the CSIRO drove a process over several years, which has led to a framework on restricted access species data, is what they call it. And what it is essentially a framework which all organizations which house data on threatened species, or any species indeed, but mostly threatened species, agree to. And most of the big players in the industry have signed up. The state governments, the federal government, the ALA, BirdLife Australia, eBird. There's a number of other groups that have also signed up to this framework, but essentially it's a blueprint for how to treat data on sensitive species, and there's an opportunity for Marba to contribute to that in that we can put together lists of Lepidoptera that we believe are sensitive to collecting or to disturbance, and we can provide that list to the Atlas of Living Australia, and they can put that to state governments. And if those lists are accepted, then that will then be treated as sensitive species by all signatories to that agreement, which means that most data on those species will be restricted, except to people who need access to it for legitimate purposes, conservation or research. So I think that's a good outcome for conservation, and I think it's something that we should engage with as an organization as well, because I think getting those lists up to date with species that genuinely need to be protected, I think is a good thing. The other thing I'd like to point out is it has to be species that legitimately need that. We have an issue in reptile conservation at the moment where, because of issues around poaching, people will not share any data whatsoever on reptiles. And so when I was working in the Queensland government, we had species of reptiles for which we had no data. And there's no way there's no data out there. It's just no one was sharing it with the Queensland government. And what that meant was when we go to make maps that guide legislation, we had threatened species of reptiles. We had not enough data to actually put a map out there, which meant that those species have received essentially no protection from vegetation clearing, which is a very perverse outcome in this case. So you do need to be careful not to, in the interests of stopping people from bad behavior with collecting, you need to be careful not to completely suppress the people who are out there with the right intentions from collecting data and providing it to people who can use it.
Which brings me to another point. I mean, collecting specimens, as we mentioned already, is actually important. And I would actually encourage members also to consider not only taking pictures and observing specimens, but when it comes to interest in Microlepidoptera or moths in general, a large number of the species are actually very poorly understood and need to be morphologically studied in order to separate different species and to be really sure about their identity and so forth. So collections have a really important part to play. And a collection such as the Australian National Insect Collection in Canberra is an enormously important resource for all of us, but it's also a living collection that requires input for the next few decades. And it's a lot of work that goes into it. And often this work is being done by amateurs who contribute their time and their expertise to bring specimens into these collections, and that is really important. And the majority of specimens are collected under ethical guidelines, and this is what we discussed is important and needs to be managed carefully, and this is what MABA stands for. All right, I think we are running out of time. Is there any other important questions that need to be brought up at this point? Maybe not. Michael, anything from your side that you want to mention at the end?
No, it's all good here, Axel. I'm just checking. There's no more comments on the chat. There was a comment about trade in invertebrates being a huge problem, but
I think it falls into the category of ethical collection. I mean, I think which we discussed, and it's possibly a problem with some butterflies and so forth. But yeah, I think we covered that topic quite well. Well, I think in general, I would say this was a really great meeting. Fantastic discussion at the end. I think that's always a good sign of a good community and an interesting presentation. And Chris, thank you for presenting this topic and leading the discussion. So fantastic work, and thanks everyone who contributed. I would also once more bring up our meeting in Canberra in December. So please keep your eyes and ears open for information relating to that meeting. And I really would love to see many of you being there in person. It's going to be great science, lots of interesting presentations, community, having dinner together, all of these things as well, and a field expedition and a workshop. So it's going to be great fun. If there is nothing else, Michael, then I would conclude the meeting. Thank you, everyone.